I hope you all are enjoying the conference as much as I am. I feel full of energy with all the great conversations and mentoring going on. So it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the next three participants in the symposium. So the first speaker will be Danny Martin. Danny Martin, can you all hear me? A little bit louder? So our first speaker will be Danny Martin. Danny Martin is a professor in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and the Department of Mathematics and Statistics and Computer Science at the University of Illinois at Chicago. His research has focused on understanding mathematical as well as racial identity development among African American learners in middle school, high school, and community college contexts. He is author of Mathematics Success and Failure Among African American Youth and editor of Mathematics Teaching, Learning, and Liberation in the Lives of Black Children. After Danny Martin, the next speaker will be Paul Cobb. Paul Cobb is professor of mathematics education at Vanderbilt University, where he holds the Peabody Chair in Teaching and Learning. His research interests focus on instructional design, issues of equity in mathematics teaching and learning, and the improvement of mathematics teaching at a large scale. He received the Hans Freudenthal Medal for a cumulative teaching program from the International Commission on Mathematics Instruction in 2005, and the Sylvia Scribner Award from AERA in 2010. He is an elected member of the National Academy of Education and an invited fellow of the Center for Advanced Studies in the Behavioral Sciences. The last member of our symposium will be Ilana Horn. Ilana Horn is an associate professor of mathematics education at Vanderbilt University. She received her MA and PhD in mathematics education from the University of California at Berkeley. Her research centers on ways to make authentic mathematics accessible to students, particularly those who have been historically disenfranchised by our educational system. This involves looking at classroom practices that engage the most students in high-quality mathematics and in how school environments, communities, colleagues, and policies shape what is instructionally possible. She taught high school mathematics for 3 years. So let's join me in welcoming our first speaker, Professor Danny Martin.
Good afternoon. Can you all hear me? Okay, great. So I want to begin by thanking the conference organizers for choosing me, for whatever reason they decided to choose me to be one of the panel speakers today. It's really good. I was here about a year ago, but it's always good to come back to UCB. This is my home as well. I consider it home. Graduated here in 1997, so I feel still connected to the place. We were given sort of a loose charge about what we would discuss under the title Research Approaches to Improving Mathematics Teaching and Learning, and we hope that we have stuck to the script and we'll have something interesting to say. So what I'm going to do is try to accomplish two things in the 20 minutes I think that I have to talk. One is to try to satisfy the research portion of why we're here. And I want to provide a very telegraphic overview of my own work, focusing mostly on what I study and why. Not so much the details of individual studies, but why I have come to settle upon the issues that I have settled upon over the course of time. And then the second thing I want to try to do with respect to mentoring, and the first part sets up the second part, is I want to pull back the curtain just a little bit. I don't have any answers to this second part, but I want to pull back the curtain just a little bit to talk about some of the issues that graduate students and early career scholars face in deciding what to research and also deciding how to craft their scholarly identities. And the reason for the first part of the talk when I talk about my own work is to give you a sense, it's not for self-promotion, I'll say that, it's to give you a sense of my own personal commitments and scholarly commitments to the issues that I think are important. And then the second is a sort of an honest realization and admission that that is not always possible given the kind of dynamics that are sometimes at play in academia and in our field in particular. And the data that I share in the second part of the presentation is actually the more interesting part of the presentation for me, because they are real examples from real graduate students who are up against some real struggles in terms of the kinds of things that they want to study and the kind of advice that they're actually receiving. It's going to be much shorter than the first part, but I think opening up that, peeling back that curtain will be very helpful for folks to think about and perhaps discuss if we have time to do that. So very quickly, I'll try to get through these first several slides. My research, if you haven't come across it before, it's very focused. It's very much centered on issues of race and identity in black learners' mathematical experiences and in their self-constructions as doers of mathematics in school and non-school contexts. And one of the concerns that I have tried to focus on over the last several years is how black learners co-construct their mathematical and racial identities. And this is not an isolation of other kinds of socially significant and socially salient identities that they construct, but those two in particular, and trying to make sense of a couple of issues that really resonate around that. And I want to at least start by saying why I focus on black learners, and this is not a statement meant to apologize for that focus, but just to give you a bit of insight. And I think we can all agree, if you look at some of the media reports, some of the educational reports, some of the policy reports, that black children's identities are socially salient. Whether that come through CNN dramatizations of, let's say, violence in Chicago, or whether that come through education reports about the achievement gap, the black-white achievement gap, there's something socially salient about black children's identities. And we have to sort of understand what those identities actually mean and how we frame and construct black children before we can actually begin to understand other aspects of who they are in terms of competencies and dispositions and beliefs, et cetera. So over the course of time, since I was a student here, until now, there have been really two, and this is my entire research program, there are two persistent questions that I try to unpack in various ways. And the first question is, what does it mean to be black in the context of mathematics learning and participation? So I foreground racial identity, and math learning and participation just happen to be the context that I'm looking at. On the other hand, I am a math educator, have taught mathematics for many, many years, so I need to foreground the fact that I'm looking at math learning and participation as areas of focus. So the second question asks, what does it mean to be a learner and doer of mathematics in the context of being black? And that question also forces us to take into account the meaning of what it actually might entail for being black for particular learners under particular sets of conditions. And given those two questions, there's a set of motivating concerns that have driven my work over, again, several different years. And I'll just mention a few of these. One of the concerns that I had going into this work as a student and also before a student, and trying to understand, and I borrowed this question from Bonnie McLeod, who is a developmental psychologist who used to be at the University of Michigan, who I think is at North Carolina now. She asked the question several years ago, what is the study of black children the study of? And this is in a developmental psychology context, and I've extended that to what is the study of black children the study of in math education research? Her answer, based on syntheses and meta-analysis of the literature, was that the study of black children for many years in developmental psychology was the study of how they differ from white children. And to some degree, that has been the trend up until several years ago in math education. The study of black children was the study of pathology, the study of limited skills, the study of failure, the study of how they, in fact, differed from white children in terms of so-called racial achievement gaps. So I've taken that as a starting point and taken that question very seriously as a fundamental question to help me orient myself to the kind of work that I do. As another example, I'll look at the third bullet, and I've asked myself and asked the field to consider, why should black children learn mathematics? You know, what's the relevance and salience of in the lives of black children in terms of their learning, their engagement in school, their investment in school? And there are many different reasons given for that. In response to that question, some people say it's about jobs and careers. Others say it's about more students in the pipeline, the commodification of black bodies, et cetera, et cetera. A number of different ways to approach that question. The second part of that is, why should black children learn mathematics? Okay, of all possible children that we could talk about, what is it about black children and their realities and their phenomenal realities and circumstances and situations that make us ask, why should this particular group of children learn this valued and vaunted area of the curriculum? And we have to think seriously about those answers before we can move to engage in any kind of design of learning environments, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a question that I have been thinking about for a long time, as I said. And then another question, as another example, is who should teach mathematics to black children? So I raised this in a paper with the title Missionaries and Cannibals. Missionaries is one kind of teacher, cannibals is another. You can read the paper to find out what those connotations mean. But it's a very serious question, and one that I find myself confronting now, given my role in teacher education, both as an administrator and as someone who teaches courses on both the education side and the math side, in terms of my own role as a gatekeeper, and a gatekeeper for who gets to become a teacher, who gets to become a teacher for children, who gets to become a teacher for black children. So these are some of the motivating concerns. I won't read all the other items on the list, but it gives you a sense, again, a sense of what motivates me to address those first two questions that I presented earlier. And the kind of work that I do, if you know a little bit about that, requires me to, as I tell my students, you have to read well beyond math education to be informed about the particular set of issues that I put on the table and that others have put on the table before me. So many of these you will recognize, and you will also understand some of the reasons why I have gravitated towards these literatures and moved through and in and beyond some of them as well. So culture practice theory, because I'm interested in issues of participation and marginality, identity, agency, and learning, much of what you've heard today and saw in some of the poster sessions and side conversations. Ecological theory, to talk about the various levels of consideration, the different kinds of contexts that we might consider, community and family, school forces, racial identity development, to make sure that I can begin to talk about black racial identity in very robust and serious ways that move us beyond references to biology, for example, in talking about issues of salience, centrality, regard, ideology, coming out of the University of Michigan in terms of some of the measures that they've used to assess snapshot views of racial identity, and racial socialization. Racial socialization that happens within the school context and when it happens outside the school context, and critical theories of race, which is not to be confused necessarily with critical race theory, but critical theories of race, whatever knowledge I need to bring to bear on understanding the implications and the meanings for race and racism, racialization processes, racial ideology in the lives of learners, but in black learners in particular. And looking at historical and structural contexts having to do with race, class, economics, et cetera, and also beginning to think about how individual people express themselves in relationship to race and class and gender and a number of other forces that impact their lives. And over the course of time, just to give you a sense of how these things sort of work themselves out from graduate student to scholar, if you will, graduate students being scholars in development, we're all in development, but from one point to another, I'll give you a sense of the evolution or revolution, because I've actually come full circle on some of these ideas, coming back to things that I learned actually here on this campus. So in 2000, I published a book, my dissertation study on black children. It was based on an ethnographic type study in Oakland. Moved from there to doing some follow-up work to begin to talk about ideas of identity and racialized forms of experience. Began to think more deeply about the conceptualizations of race that we've had in the field and problematizing those because they were applied to black learners and all learners more generally in problematic ways. And then began to think more seriously about what does it actually mean to learn mathematics while black, trying to unpack that in terms of its phenomenology. And that takes us to about 2012. And more recently, this is all sort of compacted, I'm beginning to think about the issues that I have put on the table for consideration in relationship to math content. So there's a framework that I'll briefly share where we have tried to integrate some issues of identity and content learning in particular ways, myself and science education colleagues that I've been working with. And then taking an even broader view on the field where this work takes place. And in one of the recent issues of JRME 2013, I actually began to sort of take a broad view of math education and the kind of work that takes place to ask questions about the kind of project that math education happens to be. And looking at math education as linked to and as being an example of a racial project. I don't have time to go into the details of that today, but these racial projects, of which math education is a particular type, in service to and in concert with other kinds of social projects, looking at the dynamics between those and trying to unpack our domain and our enterprise in ways that can be informative, specifically around issues of race, and for me, race with respect to black learners. And then moving beyond our own confines of the U.S. border, for example, to think about race in other contexts. So I'm in the process of revising and finishing up a paper with a scholar from Colombia who self-identifies as black, but in a Colombian context, but is also bringing to the table the fact that black learners in Colombia are experiencing their racialized identities and having racialized experiences of particular forms. And we have been able to move to the point in the field where now we actually can write, we've always done it, but we can write in a much more explicit way about race and math education. So I'm working with Nero Shah and Celia Rousseau from the University of Michigan, Memphis, on the handbook chapter for NCTM, the next version, on issues of race and math education. So going back, just to kind of show you what has happened over this time, and again, to sort of illustrate my commitments, the work that I did at UC actually started around 1992. That's when I first went out to the Oakland Hills. I won't say anything beyond that, but went out to the Oakland Hills to study at a particular school and began to work on these ideas in concert with the folks that were here to support me, the graduate students and the faculty, looking at issues of math identity, math socialization, and beginning to think seriously about racial identity as well. And that work, the struggle through that work, in fact, helped me develop a framework. And you won't be able to get all this, but it was a way for me to situate what I was trying to understand in a broad enough context where I could begin to talk about issues of history of the community, talk about the school, the community forces of various communities where math learning was taking place, engagement was taking place, some school level issues having to do with the curricular context at that time, the engagement, the success and failure patterns among black students in the schools, and then what were individual students doing to, in the face of all this, be successful. And so that framework was the starting point, and it was focused largely on student narratives, but there was some observational data there as well. Student voice, unpacking the voices of successful African-American students as a counter-narrative to all the literature that had built up focusing on African-American student failure. And that was a really interesting start. And as I said, more recently I began to expand the reach of my own narrative and working with others to think about content learning and identity construction. So that's the CLICK framework, to begin to think about specifically math and science identities in relationship to racial identities and academic identities, and what happens in math and science classrooms among various learners. And in this project, it involved 4 schools in the city of Chicago. Some of those schools were under the watch list for being closed, if you know anything about the school closures in Chicago. We had 2 lower grades, 2 upper grades, math and science split, and we have continued to work since 2012 on trying to code this data and bring some of the ideas around identity, racial identity, disciplinary identity, into the discussion of how children actually engage with content, how black children in particular engage with mathematical and scientific content. And just to give you a sense of how this is all really interesting in terms of sometimes coming full circle, the paper that I wrote about mathematics learning, or learning mathematics while black, actually makes an argument for me to come back to the place I actually started. So I started, without going into a long story, I started actually with Allen's framework when I went out to that middle school in those hills to try to understand mathematics learning among black children and move beyond the framework, but in making the arguments that I'm making now about understanding the phenomenal realities of black children, taking the second framework into account, the socialization framework, and thinking about the fact that much of the work on black children is focused on narratives and stories, in the absence of sometimes a focus on content. How can we get back to merging those two, and how can we be detailed and look at units of analysis that are appropriate to get us to the level of what do black children actually do? Not in myth, not in supposition, but what do black children actually do when they engage around issues of determining their knowledge base, looking at their strategies, their metacognitive awareness, their beliefs, and the kinds of practices that we value or not for those children. And lastly, not lastly, but I want to also make note of the fact that I have been very cognizant of the kind of work that I do because it's focused on race and black learners. And I understand very well the space where I do that work. Some of the critical policy analysis work that I've been doing for the last several years has allowed me to begin to understand the domain as an instantiation of what some folks would call white institutional space. So knowing that and being very cognizant of that, I have continued to maintain this unwavering and unequivocal commitment to doing this work, despite the fact that I understand very well the kind of space where it takes place. And I also understand that one of the consequences of the nature of this domain in many different ways is that math education research is actually deeply involved in the consumption, production, and reproduction of racial meanings, disparities, and hierarchies. And one way that that happens, I'm going to demonstrate through two quick cases that I think I can get through in the 5 minutes that I have. I've been in communication with several graduate students over the last several years who have identified me as a point person to talk about their own struggles for developing their own scholarly identities and unwavering commitment to particular kinds of issues that resonate with the kind of work that I've been doing. And I want to share with you some excerpts from 2 of the emails that I received. And I don't have any answers for what to do, but I'll end with one slide that kind of gives you a sense of the struggles that folks might be going through in terms of making those decisions. And I'll try to read through this so that you don't have to labor through it. But this is from an African-American doctoral student, and she sent me this February 9th, and there's a follow-up email on February 26th, and we've had a couple back and forth. She says, I'm a doctoral student from ABC University. I was not sure how to title this email because I received your information through a misunderstanding of my research interest. I've been given the opportunity to participate on a faculty search committee, and one of the candidates was told that I was interested in black culture. It is interesting because I never mentioned anything about culture or race since I have been here. My focus is actually leadership in math education. Nonetheless, he provided me the link to your profile and your current research sort of just confirmed an unspoken line of research that I want to pursue after graduation. I've been thinking about researching and working with African-American teachers, educators, and finding their voice in mathematics education. After reading through a few of your articles, I realized this is a sort of culture in itself. A couple of weeks pass. I respond to her. I say, I don't know why you sent me the email as well. I don't know what's going on, but I'm willing to help if you have anything you want to talk to about in the future. So she followed up. And out of the blue, I get the second email. She says, I've had several conversations with fellow scholars, and we wanted to know the best approach to starting or continuing research with African Americans or black Americans without being labeled the black researchers. One of my friends could not find a chair in her department because she is researching African Americans in her discipline, and others have been encouraged to stay away from any racial topics for fear of being locked in a box. How did you navigate around this issue if you've had to deal with it? We wanted some guidance before researching what is really important to us. Okay, so that kind of peels back that curtain. So while I gave you that sort of disjointed presentation of my own work, and I called it unwavering and unequivocal, I'm not a fool to believe that other folks are not forced to sort of engage in particular kinds of struggles to do the same thing. So this is the second example, and it comes from a young white graduate student, female, who is at a very large university, and she was a math graduate student, and she transitioned to public policy. As a math graduate student, she was a little disconcerted about the fact that she didn't see a lot of black students, for example, in her program, and she wanted to sort of understand the policy implications and reasons for that. So she says, I'm a doctoral student in public policy. I've enjoyed reading your books because of my research interests. However, I've been told that pursuing research similar to yours may not be possible in a public policy program, and I'm curious if you have any opinion on this issue. I hope to study mathematics education policy for minority learners. My experience as one of the few women in mathematics doctoral program led to my interest in math education for black students, in particular because I was disturbed by the lack of any black students in my program. I received my master's degree in math and decided to join the public policy doctoral program. I've been reading literature pertaining to minority math learners. I'm also very interested in critical theory and would like to use it in my dissertation. She goes on to say, however, faculty members in my department are concerned that I may need too much education knowledge rather than policy knowledge in order to pursue my interests. For example, I did some preliminary work to examine minority K-12 students' evaluations and their teachers related to achievement, but I was discouraged from pursuing this further due to the required education knowledge. I tried to contact a few education professors at XY University, but their research is not very close to what I would like to pursue. I'm wondering if you could help me answer a few questions. Do I need an education degree in order to study ways to improve mathematics education? for minority learners, or could a public policy degree suffice? Yes. So I want to end, this is my very last slide, just by saying that, and I'll say that, in fact, Indigo, as Monday, had a panel session at NCTM, and I think my first line of commentary is that the ish is real. So some of you know what that means if you follow youth culture. And it's a very real phenomenon, and I don't know what to suggest in a forum like this. There may be things I would be more willing to say perhaps in one-on-one, but I want to acknowledge that sometimes the decisions are tough because you may be trying to craft your researcher identity and scholarly agenda in service to the knowledge and expertise of your faculty members. We know that that happens. You have to negotiate that. You may be doing it in relationship to excellent reform and policy context. You may be doing it in relationship to hot topics. So some things come and go. So for me, for example, Common Core is important, but it's not going to determine or define the nature and direction of my research agenda. And I think the questions that I try to raise are reform proof, if you will. It doesn't really matter what reform we have on the table because those questions will be very, very persistent given the nature of the phenomenon. Sometimes people want to chase the funding because you know what's fundable, and that's certainly a possibility. And then there sometimes are commitments. These are not mutually exclusive. Sometimes pressing unresolved problems with particular social consequences that drive us. And that may be linked to other identities and commitments that are important to you or us or me. And I just want to acknowledge those. So what I have tried to do in relationship to the charge was to talk a little bit about my own work in a very telegraphic way, but to try to end with the fact that even if you turn to my work as one kind of example of the kind of thing that you want to study, just be well aware that, as these examples show at the end, that there may be some bumps in the road and you will have to define for your own sense of self what's important and what contributions you want to make towards advancing research on mathematics teaching and learning. I will stop there because I think my time is up. Thank you.